I am Jonathan Oliver. I'm currently at TCU as an assistant professor. Before then, I actually did my doctorate here at Texas A&M, and prior to that, I was at University of Texas. So I've had the Longhorns and the Aggies. And then following my doctorate here, I had the opportunity to go to Virginia Beach, where I worked with Navy SEALs with Naval Special Warfare, and I was there for about a year and have been at TCU just over a year now. So I've had some good opportunities along the way to do some really cool research. And one thing that I'm really passionate about, and one of my students came up the other day and they said, or actually a friend too said, "Are you ever going to get tired of studying cluster sets?" And I said, "Nah, it's not going to happen." And it's literally because there's so much we can actually do with it, and I'm hoping you're going to see that afterwards. I'm going to go through the presentation, but I'm going to leave quite a bit of time for questions at the end, because what I find is once people know what cluster sets are, they want to know how to implement them in their program. So with this one, we're going to talk about greater gains in strength and power using cluster sets and hypertrophic training. So primarily, we're focusing on that time. If you're doing traditional periodization, it's the base phase. It's that base phase where you're focusing on intensities of somewhere between 65 and 80%. So let's start off. If we look at traditional set and rep configurations, what we see is the ideal load, the goal repetitions, the ideal sets, and the rest. Well, with strength, we know we operate best above 85% 1RM. This is straight from the NSCA manual. Power, we're looking at 80 to 90% for single effort, and then multiple effort is 75 to 85. When we get down into hypertrophy, we're looking at 67 to 85%. Goal repetitions is 6 to 12, 3 to 6 sets, 30 seconds to a minute and a half rest. Originally, that 30 seconds was based on some research looking at single sets where they saw these huge jumps in testosterone levels and other anabolic hormone levels. Since then, what they've really found out is that as long as the rest is somewhere around 2 to 3 minutes, you're still going to be okay, and you still get the hypertrophic gains. And when you don't focus on that 30-second, your next set is actually of higher magnitude. And muscular endurance, I don't know about you, I just pretty much stay away from it. Sorry. All right. Examples of a traditional configuration. So here I have an example of what a traditional configuration looks like, and we all know what it is. You do 6 sets, rest 2 minutes, then repeat it 4 times. Here's a hypertrophy scheme. You do 10 reps, you'd rest 2 minutes, you'd repeat it 4 times. We know that. Reps are performed continuously, one after another. You may concentrate more on the eccentric or more on the concentric, but they're still performed continuously, one after another. What do we know about progressive resistance training? If any of you went in the gym right now and we watched you, what we're going to see is if you're doing a bench press, if you're doing a power clean, if you're doing a squat, is the amount of force you can generate over time starts to decline. That's why you can only do 1 rep at 100%. That's why you can only do 2 to 3 at 95%, because after those 2 or 3 reps, you're unable to generate the force. More importantly, is what we see is if you do repetitions in a continuous fashion, we see declines in velocity. So this study was actually done and they looked at repetitions to failure. So they took intensities from 65 to 80%, 1RM, and they just had the individuals, males and females, do them to failure. What they found is that after the first repetition, you already see significant drops in velocity in the bench press and in the back squat. So if we want to train athletes or train ourselves to be more powerful, why do we allow velocity and force to decrease? So what we've recognized over time is that fatigue in and of itself is a portion of what happens when you perform repetitions continuously. So that takes into account that it could be a decrease in force, it could be a decrease in velocity, but more importantly, since both of those contribute to power output, fatigue is a decrease in power output over consecutive reps. So automatically, after that first rep, your power output declines before the second one. And in fact, this is doing bench press at approximately 85% 1RM, and this was trained athletes. I believe they were basketball players, and you see immediate decline all the way through the 6th rep. So why is this important? Real quick, let's talk about some causes of this. I don't want to get sciencey on you guys, but some of the reasons for causes for this fatigue have been acidosis. They've said it was acidosis originally. They've kind of said it's not that anymore. Inorganic phosphate adenine diphosphate. These are all metabolites of energy when you're doing breakdown. However, over time, we still really don't know what that cause is. What we do know is that phosphocreatine, which is, everybody knows phosphocreatine, it's the thing that we use for most of our power, it's that short energy system. We know that the time course to resynthesize that is fairly rapid. In this study, what they did is they depleted phosphocreatine levels. So they had somebody go until their phosphocreatine was completely depleted, similar to what you do if you do a set to failure. Within 2 minutes, it's already replenished almost completely. So you're seeing it replenish really quickly. So what if you didn't take a set to failure? You wouldn't see drops this far, right? So originally, Greg Half, who's now down in Australia, presented this hypothetical model of what a cluster set should be. So here in this top, we have a traditional set. This is a theoretical velocity and displacement. Displacement, this was in regards to a power clean, the displacement of the bar from the floor up. So he theorized that as you performed repetition in a continuous fashion, you'd see a decline in velocity and a decline in displacement. He further theorized that if you put a brief rest after every repetition, that you'd be able to maintain velocity and displacement. So this idea of the brief rest was hypothesized that you'd allow for a partial replenishment of phosphocreatine. So while we don't know the exact cause of what causes fatigue, what we know is that current theories all suggest that inclusion of a brief rest would actually increase the ability to generate force, velocity, and power. And this is important again for this SAID principle, specific adaptation-induced demands. That's what we want. So what are cluster sets? Well, first we need to go over a couple of definitions because you see them when you're looking at, whether it's NSCA, whether it's T-Nation, whether it's the CrossFit Journal, everybody uses a different term for what rest is. So for us today, and I'd like to see a more universal use of these terms, but interset rest is simply rest between sets. So in a strength set, you do a set, you rest, do another set. That's that rest in between. Inter-repetition rest is rest in between individual repetitions. So that means if I do a repetition, rest a brief time, do another repetition, in between that repetition is what's called inter-repetition rest. Finally, intra-set rest is rest between groups of repetitions within a given set. So that brings us to what a cluster set actually is. A cluster set is a set, changing a set configuration to where it now contains rest between the individual repetitions, which is inter-repetition rest, or within groups or clusters of repetitions, which is intra-set rest. So all of this has come about fairly recently, and what we've known, here's just a couple examples real quick of some cluster sets. Here's a traditional set of 6 repetitions, 2 minutes rest, repeat 4 times. In our world, we call these singles. So you do a repetition, rest 15 to 30 seconds, do another, rest again. In this one, we'd call it doubles. You do 4 sets of 3 doubles. And in the final, it's triples, so you do 4 sets of 2 triples. So over time, there have been a number of acute studies. When I say acute studies, what they did is they just looked at one exercise bout. So they took somebody through a set or 4 sets, and that was it. They didn't look at long-term. What's going to happen if I implement this long-term? So acute studies, what they found is, in fact, that you do get less reduction in force. I can, put a weight down, lift it back up. I'm going to generate more force. Chronic training, however, we found no difference in strength gains, smaller gains in strength, and greater high-velocity strength gains. So there's some conflicting information. We don't want to lose strength, but we want to increase power. So how do we do both of these? Some of the problems with some of these early studies where they used untrained subjects, which I'll talk about that a little bit more later. They used single joint exercises. How many of you know anybody who's going to perform a bicep curl explosively or a leg extension explosively? And they used isolation exercises, and it's been stated that the ability to generate power is dependent on the movement involved, and so that goes back to just what I said. And they sought to determine the mechanism for strength gains So they didn't really look at power output. What they were trying to see is if fatigue was necessary to induce long-term strength adaptations. So many of the early studies were trying to look at if I increased force over successive repetitions, if I could actually increase my ability to gain strength. So later studies came about and did a couple of other things. They started looking at power output, and they started looking at trained athletes, and finally they started looking at movement-specific bench press, squat, power clean, snatch, pulls. What they found out, and it's important to know these intensities, is they found greater total power output in the bench press at approximately 85% 1RM. So that's in the strength area, right? They found greater peak velocity at 90 and 120% 1RM clean pull, but no difference in peak power. So that's just the clean pull. They found greater force, velocity, and power during the power clean at 80%. 80% is an important number to remember for the power clean. They found greater power output during ballistic jump squats. They found less reliance on anaerobic glycolysis. Basically, that's saying lower lactate levels after each set. And finally, they found that they were able to do greater total volume work. So if you broke up a set, you could actually add another set on the end and get more out of the total set. So your total volume load would actually be greater. However, when you take it long term again, we have a problem. Smaller strength gains with no difference in power output, that's again at that 85%. That's our strength training zone. Greater output, power output with no difference in strength training using varying intensities, 70 to 85%. So it's down in that hypertrophy phase, right? And they found no difference in strength gains, but greater power. If I can have the same amount of strength gains and greater power, that's better than just normal power from a strength training workout and normal strength, right? I'm getting one that's better than I normally would. That's what we want. Finally, we have greater total volume with no difference in strength gains. So we got another greater total volume load. And then lastly, we found smaller strength gains with the likely greater peak power and velocity. So what does this really mean? What did acute studies suggest? We could do more. We could do greater total volume load. We'd be able to generate greater power. We could get stronger. So that's what the acute studies told us. That's why you have to look at what the training adaptations are, because if I look at this, all I'd want to do is train with cluster sets. I'd be Superman. However, when we look at the long term, we were able to do more. Athletes were able to do more, but they weren't as strong, they were less strong, and they weren't as powerful. That's not what we want. So the idea is, how do we manipulate our set and rep and rest configurations? How do we manipulate those training variables to get greater adaptations than what we normally experience doing the normal or traditional training? So we went back and we thought, and we said, well, with strength training, it's always greater than 85% 1RM. What do we know? EMG, which is a measure of the muscle activity, increases pretty much linearly when you're doing 6 repetitions. According to the size principle, the greater recruitment, the more EMG activity, right? What we know about power training is there's this idea of an optimal load. For those of you who don't know what the optimal load is they've taken different exercises, squat, bench press, power clean, power snatch, and they've looked at what load, going from 10% up to 95% 1RM, develops the greatest power output. A lot of times people are like, oh, that's 30%. That's what you learned back in undergraduate ex-phys. It's not. It's actually around 80% the 1RM in the power clean. Remember that number back before that I told you, the 80% 1RM? It showed that they had greater improvement. It's right around 40 to 60% in bench press, and it's around 50 to 70% 1RM in the back squat. All of these intensities are much closer to the intensities we used if we went back to that first slide for hypertrophy than they are for anything else. That's where the optimal load is. It's really close to that 60 to 80%. So, our recommended hypertrophy variables, however, say, again, 65 to 80%. Our repetitions are 1 to 12. Repetition speed is typically slow to moderate. Rest period, 2 to 3 minutes for core lifts, and you can go 1 to 2 minutes for assistive lifts. Multiple sets, 4 to 6 days per week, muscle group split routines. What does that produce? It makes us big. but what does it also do? Makes us slow. So, while it was initially thought, again, that 1 to 2 minutes, we can now understand that rest can be played with a little bit. What they found is that when volume and intensity were equated up to 5 minutes, you could still go up to 5 minutes. So it appears that when you're talking about hypertrophy gains, that if the total volume load is the same, as long as the intensity is the same, that you will get the gains. Does everybody understand? So I could do 4 by 10 at 75%, or I could do 10 by 4 at 75%, but as long as that total volume load, which is your reps times sets times load, was the same, I should get the same hypertrophic response, in theory. That's what we kind of proposed in theory. So this study was our initial study. We went through and we wanted to look at trained athletes, putting them on a hypertrophic training, a standard 12-week training period, periodized, all exercises, exercise order, intensity, and volume were consistent between groups. So everything we did, we kept it consistent between groups. We didn't allow anybody to go over weight they were supposed to. We didn't allow anybody to cut back. We forced reps. We did whatever we had to, but they got the same total volume load after it was all done. What did we measure? We looked at body composition. We looked at strength and power of upper and lower body, and we measured it 4 times. We measured it before they start. We measured it at 4 weeks, 8 weeks, and 12 weeks. And at each of those times that we measured strength and power, we then adjusted their 1RMs and did the next 4 weeks. So this is what the training program looked like. So traditional did 4 sets of 10 with 2 minutes rest on compound lifts and 3 times 10 with 1.5 minutes rest for assistive lifts. Whereas the cluster set training did 4 by 2 by 5 with 1 minute intra-set rest and inter-set rest on compound lifts and 3 by 10 with 1.5 minutes for assistive lifts. So what does that mean? Basically, they did 8 sets of 5 with 1 minute rest. To simplify that, they did 8 sets of 5 with 1 minute rest. Why we did that is we wanted to keep the amount of rest consistent between both groups, because as a strength conditioning coach, you have a limited amount of time and you want to be able to make the best use of that time. Week 1, they went 65, week 2 was 70, week 3, 75%. We deloaded on week 4 and we tested them in week 4. We used the new 1RM to again go 65, 70, 75, and then back down to 60. Again, all major lifts were performed according to the group assignment, either traditional or cluster, whereas all assistive lifts were the same. All rest intervals, we timed every one of them. We had stopwatches. We had about 5 people working during this time. Compliance was set at 90%, which means all of our athletes who participated did so at 90% of the time. This gentleman back here has a squat of 515 pounds. That's how intense the workout was. He thought he was going to throw up a couple of times. Traditional versus cluster. So this is how it looked. Set of 10, 2 minutes rest, repeat 4 times. Cluster, it was just 5, 1 minute, 5, 1 minute. So you see it's just 8 by 5. This was our exercise program. So we had day 1 was upper body and push. So we started off with bench press, incline dumbbell, seated dumbbell military press. Those 3 compound lifts were all done according to group assignment. Then they did their auxiliary lifts or assistive lifts, and they just did 3 by 10. Day 2 was lower body and pull, where they did squats, leg press, partial deadlift to power shrug. Those were all the compound lifts that they performed according to group assignment. Then they returned and did all the assistive lifts the same. We had a day off, and then they came back and did another upper body where we changed the exercises a bit, and then we did a final day of lower body pull. So it was a 2-day on, 1 day off, 2 day on, 2 days off routine. Went out for 12 weeks. So in this table, all we're showing is that the total volume load remained consistent between groups. So this shows major lifts, upper body, lower body. The total volume between both groups was not different. We forced that to happen, and I'm going to tell you why here in a second. Assistive lifts, same thing. Total volume load, sets times reps times weight was the same. So what do we have happen? Well, this is the gains in lean mass. So goal of this program was to gain lean mass, right? It was a hypertrophy training, gain lean mass. These represent significant difference. As you can see, there is no difference here between traditional and cluster in weight. There is no difference here over time between cluster and traditional in lean mass. There is no difference here in anything between percent fat. So what is that saying? There was no difference between groups in how much lean mass they gained, how much total weight they gained, or how much fat mass they lost, which they lost no fat mass. It was typically just designed to increase lean mass. They gained lean mass, they increased weight, and they didn't gain fat. It did what it was supposed to. That's what the training program was. By the way, I didn't say at the beginning, these were trained Marines that actually took part in this program. This was not an untrained study, this was Marines. Again, no change in fat mass. There you see, increase after 4 weeks was 1.3%, 2.6% at 8 weeks, and 2.7% at 12 weeks. These are guys who had been already participating in resistance training. Bench press. So bench press 1RM, what's this showing? Interesting right here is that the purple line is always going to be cluster sets. You see a increase, consistent increase over time in 1RM bench press. Traditional set, we actually saw them decline after the first week. During the first day of training when we started this study, because we didn't pilot, which was bad on our part, we put these guys through the training program. Guys in the traditional set could not finish 10 repetitions at 65%. They were not used to doing that type. They were power type athletes. They were not used to doing 65%. By the time they got to 70%, we were forcing reps. So this took a huge adaptation. They actually dropped 1.6%, which was significantly different. And then you see the increase here by the end was 13.7% versus 9.2% with traditional. So what's that saying? I get greater strength gains with cluster sets than I do with traditional in the upper body. I also got greater strength gains in back squat with cluster sets instead of traditional. So thus far I've got the same amount of lean mass gains, but I'm getting greater strength gains in bench press and greater strength gains in back squat. So I'm stronger, I'm also the same amount of lean mass gain. But what about our important one, power? Bench press power, 15% increase, only 6.1. Because anytime you train, you're going to get adaptations across all three. Significant difference between the two. Again, cluster sets, greater upper body power. Back squat power, close to 50% increase in back squat power. Vertical jump power, again, same thing, greater increase. Absolute power changes. What are we talking about absolute power changes? Well, we went back, because what we're really trying to do is get an athlete to be able to move that weight that we started them moving quicker anyway. We want to increase their velocity. So we went back and we took their initial 1RM weight at 60%, same thing they tested on in the beginning, and looked at what the changes was over time. As you can see, 12.5 or almost 13% here in the bench press and almost 22% there in the back squat. Again, cluster sets were better than traditional sets. So what is this saying? Basically at intensities from 65 to 75% 1RM, which is what we typically use in our hypertrophy training, cluster sets increased power greater, they got greater strength gains, and the lean mass gains were the same. Additionally, what we looked at is we were looking at if we did see these adaptations, where was the adaptation occurring? So we pulled muscle out of these guys. We wanted to see what the changes in fiber types were. Everybody knows 2X, fast ones, type 1, slow ones. The difference is there were no differences. They all increased across the board. So what does this tell us about cluster sets? When it comes to hypertrophy training, you can get as big as, but you're going to get faster and you're going to get stronger. So that's my proponent for cluster sets and hypertrophy training. What was interesting, as I said, is we wanted to go back and we want to look at each individual set. And just to show you what it actually looks like, this is a squat performed with someone's power. Does everybody know what a Fitradine is or a Tendo unit? You attach to the bar, you see what the power is. This is what the decrease in power looks like on the back squat with the 75% 1RM and trained athletes. So this is set 1, 2, all the way through 4. What you're seeing is interesting, and we found this consistently. It's always a second rep that ends up being more powerful than the first rep. We don't know why, but you still see a steady, this is the black line, steady decline. Decline, and then it starts lower, decline, it starts even lower, decline, starts even lower, decline. Cluster set. We do decline the first 5, but then we come back up. Go back again. So it's happening exactly like we thought it would. So what would happen if we actually broke that down even further? I don't personally know that, but somebody's actually doing that study right now. This is another one we looked at, and we wanted to really look at what did blood lactate do as far as clusters compared to traditional set. What we found, blood lactate was consistently lower after set 2. So when you're getting this metabolic fatigue, buildup of lactate, with traditional sets, you're not getting the same thing when you're doing cluster sets. Additionally, we came back and used another 12 trained athletes, and instead of forcing the load, forcing the total volume load, we wanted to see what actually happened when we didn't force reps. This is what happens. In the 4th set, in trained athletes, they couldn't maintain the load. We had to drop it. So this is 4th set. By the 6th repetition, we started having to drop weight. For them to get all repetitions, we have to drop weight. It drops even further in 7, 8, 9, all the way down to 10. They cannot maintain. So over a complete set, we get greater total volume load with cluster than we do with traditional. The question that's always been asked is, if you're getting all this, is there any hormonal response? Because everybody believes that hormonal response, and it does in some way play a role in hypertrophic gains. Total testosterone, there's no difference in the response between cluster sets and traditional sets. Free testosterone, there was no difference between cluster sets and traditional sets. Growth hormone, there is a difference. Growth hormone is actually a little bit lower following a cluster set than it is a traditional set. No differences in cortisol, which is our catabolic hormone. So what this kind of brought us to is this idea of a mixed method approach that has been kind of proposed by Greg Half. And this is a recommended approach when training for power. So if we take a look at all 4 of these graphs up here, which is your force velocity curve, we understand that we need to operate in all of these to actually shift that power curve to the right. So you get a greater transfer of training effect, and the idea is you use both low load, high velocity movements and high load training. So if we use low load, high velocity movements, we're working down here. Low load, high velocity. If we only work high load training, we're working up here. The idea is to shift it this way. So we like this idea of a mixed methods approach to training. So how do I take that mixed methods approach and incorporate it into my strength conditioning program? This is if you're using traditional type periodization. It can also be used in undulating. Ideally, you'd use it in hypertrophy. So what you'd use it on are your traditional lifts, your compound movements, and your Olympic lifts. Why? Because it's that ideal intensity, close to that optimal load, and it maintains form while improving velocity and power output. During strength and power training, what are you getting here though? If we go back to this graph, you're actually getting this mid-load high velocity because you're actually taking this middle load here and you're shifting it because the velocity that you're able to achieve with cluster sets is greater if you use hypertrophy training. Strength and power, which again would be this area of the force velocity curve, when to use it during traditional Olympic, allows ability to maintain intensity, so you can maintain the intensity through the workout, and you get this mixed methods approach. So how would you incorporate it? It's a low load, high velocity, so if you were to use the low load for power, high load, which is the traditional form to increase strength, but then what about high load, high velocity? So in addition to your strength training of doing 4 sets of 6, you can also incorporate 4 sets of 2 by 3, because those 2 sets, or 4x2x3 are going to be faster. It's a high load, high velocity. So you can do 85%, and the ability to move that quicker is going to be much better. Power, it's a no-brainer. You should always use cluster sets in power for traditional and Olympic. You're going to get greater velocity and power with form maintenance. You're going to do, again, the mixed methods approach, low load, high velocity, high load, and high load, high velocity. But that there is this area where we need to use judgment, and that judgment needs to be used in that strength phase. Because what they did find out in some of those earlier studies is that in that strength phase, you really need that 85% to fatigue, or to increase that EMG activity, muscle activity, to recruit all the motor units necessary to get strength gains. Does that mean exclude it from strength training? No, it just means that you need to use both when you're doing strength training. And there are still other non-power related training places where you need to use judgment, i.e. Bodybuilders. However, we're actually about to begin a study now. If you can do greater total volume load, can you actually get a greater hypertrophic gain if you add an extra set? Because what we found is that if I do 8 sets of 5 at 75%, I can actually make that 8 sets of 5 at 80%, or 10 sets of 5 at 75%. So I get a greater total volume load when I use cluster sets. All right, so are there any questions?
Any idea why there may have been a diminished growth hormone response in the cluster training group, or could it have just been a sample size?
Lactate. The lactate response is going to stimulate some growth hormone.
Can you give this to us? Your PowerPoint?
Yeah.
Have these results been replicated in any other study, or is this?
Yeah, they've been replicated in 2 studies now. We're about to publish another one. Yeah. And actually make that 3. Acutely, they've been replicated in 3 to 4. Training-wise, they've been replicated in 2. Training adaptations has been replicated in 2.
Do you know where those other studies were replicated at?
This one that I just talked about is in JSCR. The one that we have under review right now, it's going to be presented at NSCA this summer. One is in Journal of Applied Physiology, and it's called Training to Failure versus Training Not to Failure. They don't call it cluster sets. You'll hear that a lot. They won't call it cluster sets. They'll just say training to failure versus training not to failure. We all know that 75% should be you be able to get 10 repetitions. So what they did in that study is they looked at it at a periodized approach. So they did the first stage, second stage, and last stage. Everybody was doing power exercises, and there was no difference. There was not cluster or traditional in the last phase. There was cluster in the strength, and there was cluster in the hypertrophy, and that's the one that I talked about at first, that they showed increases in power, no difference in strength. They didn't measure lean mass on that one, and so that's kind of why we went back and wanted to see what lean mass actually did.
What journal are you going to publish the size-specific study in?
Which one?
Yeah.
The training study?
The one where you're just specifically looking at size gains.
That's already been published. It's in Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research. Both training studies have already been published. One's in JSCR and the other one's in JAP.
So what's the one that you're looking at now?
The one we're looking at now is a hormonal response. We looked at the hormonal response, and we looked at untrained versus trained, because we thought there may be a little bit of difference in the force, velocity, and power curves in the untrained compared to the trained. Well, we found out besides having lower total volume load, power curves, velocity curves, it all looks the same in trained versus untrained. And interestingly enough, the hormonal response was the same too. Any other questions?
So, are you saying, do you train exclusively with cluster sets? Do you use a combination of cluster and traditional?
I recommend using a combination of traditional and cluster. If you're doing, let's say you're doing a traditional periodization, going from hypertrophy into your strength into your more power phase. Hypertrophy, always use cluster. There's no reason you don't want to slow the athlete down. Strength, I would incorporate both. And then when you get to power, straight cluster. We're actually about to implement it at the high school level to see how that actually works with younger athletes as well. All right. Thank you. Oh. We were trying to keep the rest consistent between both groups. So if you have 4 sets of 10 with 2 minutes rest, and then we had 4 sets of 2 by 5 with 1 minute rest. So the total time to complete the set we were trying to make it the same. What we actually found out is because the cluster sets were able to be done so much quicker, it actually was faster to do cluster sets than it was traditional. Because you hear strength coaches, oh, I can't break up sets, I can't do this. Well, if you break them up, you actually get the athlete done faster.
So did you find that 1 minute was the most optimal time to rest?
No, we did not. We just went with 1 minute because it was consistent. The second study we did, we actually used 30 seconds. So what we did is we did, 4 by 2 by 5 with 30 seconds intra-set rest, but a minute and a half inter-set rest. So 30 seconds between the sets of 5, but between the sets of 4 by 2 by 5, it was a minute and a half. Again, we were trying to keep the rest consistent, but we wanted to see if they could turn over faster. And the latter study that you saw with the hormone response and the power curve, that was actually 4 by 2 by 5 with 30 seconds and a minute and a half.
You traditionally have athletes paired up or working in groups of 3?
In the study that we had, since we had so many stopwatches and we had to watch everybody, we just had everybody starting 5 minutes after one another. The way we're going to implement it at the high school level is, again, it's going to be just in groups on the platforms.
Is there a difference between inter-repetition rest or inter-set rest?
Inter-repetition rest is if I were to break it up into single repetitions.
I mean, did you guys notice a difference by doing it those different
We've not done it that way. Other people have done it that way, and they found that this idea of 15 to 30 seconds came about because there has been a study that did 20 seconds and 40 seconds, and there was no difference between 20 and 40. So it came to be that this 15 to 30 seconds was kind of ideal. The problem with inter-repetition rest that I find is that it really extends the workout. Or you'd have to make that inter-repetition rest really short to make it equal. The place to use inter-repetition rest is during Olympic lifting, because then you really want everybody to drop the weight, reset, take however much time, and go back again. All right, thank you.